And although you kind of know that this might happen, you don't really think about it very much.
The palace did not erupt with shouting. It went quiet. That was what made the moment terrifying. King Charles had made his decision, and the words were simple enough to fit on a single line. Princess Anne would be confirmed as the sole heir to the Queen's private estate. But inside the royal household, that line landed like thunder. Old loyalties cracked, private fears surfaced, and no one in the room could pretend this was ordinary. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles sat at the head of the table and let the silence stretch until it became unbearable. He placed the confirmation file down with a slow, final movement, and every person present understood that something deeply personal had crossed into royal history. The Queen's private estate, the personal property, family gifts, letters, keepsakes, and possessions held outside official crown ownership was no longer surrounded by uncertainty. The phrase sole heir meant one person would hold exclusive authority over that private legacy, and the king had chosen Anne. Anne did not smile. She did not lean forward like a winner claiming a prize. The princess sat rigidly, as if the air itself had changed around her, because this was not victory. This was duty arriving with its full weight. She had spent a lifetime proving that loyalty could be quiet, disciplined, and brutal in its honesty. Now Charles had placed the late monarch's most intimate world into her hands, and Anne understood that every locked drawer, every handwritten note, every family object would carry her mother's voice. Camilla felt the blow before anyone explained it. The queen consort kept her face controlled, but the wound was there, sharp and unmistakable. This was not just about jewels, rooms, or inheritance. It was about trust. Charles had not turned to the woman beside him. He had turned to his sister. Camilla knew what that meant inside a family, where every gesture is read like a declaration, and she knew the palace would read it too. William watched the king with careful eyes. The prince understood the decision was not only about who received what, but who could protect the monarchy's memory without bending it toward comfort. A sealed inventory list was mentioned, a formal record of private objects, letters, gifts, and possessions, and the future king saw several faces change as soon as those words entered the room. Something in that list frightened people. Something in it mattered too much. Charles closed the file, but the silence did not break. Anne looked down, Camilla looked away, and William stayed still, because one truth had begun to rise between them. This decision had not been born that morning. Someone in the room already knew it had started much earlier, after a private incident that changed the king's mind forever. But before the palace could understand why Anne had been chosen, everyone had to face what each royal stood to lose. A royal estate is never just property. It is memory, rank, power, and pain locked behind polished doors. For Charles, this was about protecting his mother's final wishes. For Anne, it was a burden she had never asked to carry. For Camilla, it felt like a public wound delivered in private. And for William, the decision revealed something colder. The future of the crown was being shaped by who could be trusted with the past. Charles knew the choice would wound the people closest to him. He had not confirmed Anne because it was easy. He had confirmed her because the Queen's private estate, the personal possessions, letters, gifts, and family items that belonged to Elizabeth outside the official crown, needed one firm guardian. The king understood that if control was divided, every object could become a debate, every memory could become a weapon, and every family feeling could turn into pressure. That was why his face carried no triumph, only strain. Anne understood that burden better than anyone in the room. The princess had spent her life beside duty, never chasing softness, never asking to be placed at the center of royal drama. Yet now the late monarch's private world had been placed in her hands, and she felt the weight of it. Anne quietly touched the edge of the file, but did not open it. That small movement said everything. Even she feared what might be inside the estate records, because the past does not stay silent when it is locked away. Camilla watched that gesture and felt the distance grow. The queen consort had stood beside Charles through storms, scandals, and the long road to acceptance. But this decision told her there were still rooms she could not enter. Her role beside the king did not automatically give her power over Elizabeth's private legacy. That truth cut deeper than any public slight, because it came from within the family itself. Camilla leaned toward Charles and asked in a low voice whether the decision had been made before she was told. He did not answer quickly. William saw the pause. The prince heard what was not spoken, and he understood the danger. This was not simply inheritance. This was discipline. If Anne held the estate, the monarchy might stay steady. But if the choice exposed old resentments, then the same decision meant to protect Elizabeth's memory could split the household open. William studied Charles, then glanced toward Anne, knowing the future king would one day face the same impossible balance between love and authority. Charles finally looked at Camilla, but his silence had already answered more than words could. Anne kept her hand near the file. William remained still. And somewhere inside that sealed estate lay more than jewelry, rooms, and treasured objects. It held proof of what Elizabeth valued, what she protected, and what she feared would happen after she was gone. And buried behind that decision was a single moment everyone had tried to forget, until it became impossible to ignore. The decision did not begin with lawyers. It began with silence in a corridor. Months earlier, during a private Christmas gathering at Sandringham, Charles witnessed something that changed the atmosphere around the Queen's legacy forever. A door had been left half open. A conversation had gone too far. And by the time Anne stepped into the hallway, one truth had become unavoidable. The estate needed protection from ambition. Charles had not meant to hear it. He had stepped away from the noise of the family gathering, carrying the heavy tiredness of a son still living in the shadow of his mother's absence. Sandringham, the royal family's private country estate in Norfolk, often used for Christmas gatherings, had always been a place of tradition, memory, and controlled warmth. But that evening, the hallway felt different. The king stopped when he heard a senior household official lower his voice. Then another voice answered. It belonged to one of Camilla's aides. The aide asked whether certain private pieces from the Queen's estate inventory could be reviewed before the formal decisions were finalized. An estate inventory is simply the official list of personal items, gifts, letters, keepsakes, and valuables connected to a private legacy. The words sounded polite. That made them worse. Charles heard enough to understand the danger. This was not a demand. It was a test. If one person could ask early, another could ask later. If one object could be reviewed quietly, then Elizabeth's private wishes could slowly become palace currency. Anne entered the corridor before anyone could soften the moment. The princess saw the household official go pale. She saw the aide fall silent, and she understood what Charles had just heard. Anne did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her presence changed the temperature at once, because she carried the kind of authority that came from a lifetime of refusing games. The aide stepped back, but the damage had already been done. Charles looked at his sister, and she looked back, as if both had reached the same conclusion without speaking. Anne confronted Charles later in private, not with anger, but with cold clarity. She told the king that Elizabeth's private wishes could not become a bargaining table for anyone's comfort. Charles listened because he knew she was right, and because the Queen had trusted Anne's judgment in ways the family rarely discussed aloud. William learned of the incident afterward through a documented palace account prepared for the king's private office, and the prince finally understood why his father had become distant whenever the estate was mentioned. Charles carried that corridor inside him for months. Anne carried it too. William watched the silence grow around them, while Camilla never fully understood why certain doors began closing before the final decision was even made. The Christmas corridor incident became the hidden trigger behind everything that followed. It turned concern into action. It turned memory into duty. And once the truth behind the decision surfaced, the palace no longer feared paperwork. It feared the conversation that Charles and Camilla could no longer avoid. When Camilla finally faced Charles, there were no aides in the room, no courtiers to soften the words, and no polished palace language left to hide behind. She wanted to know why Anne had been trusted above everyone else. He wanted her to understand that this was not punishment. But in that private room, every sentence became heavier, every pause sharper, and the marriage at the center of the monarchy trembled under the weight of the Queen's shadow. Camilla stood near the doorway, as if crossing the room would make the wound more real. Charles remained seated, his hand resting close to the confirmation file, but not touching it. The file mattered because it carried the formal wording of the decision, a written palace record confirming who held authority over the Queen's private estate. The Queen consort looked at it, then looked at the King, and her voice dropped. She asked whether Anne had been chosen because Charles no longer trusted anyone else near Elizabeth's private belongings. Charles did not answer with anger. That made the moment worse. He looked tired, almost broken by the duty he had forced himself to carry. The King told Camilla that some legacies could not be shared simply to preserve comfort. He said his mother's private world had to be protected from pressure, from misunderstanding, and from anyone who might see memory as influence. Camilla heard the words, but she also heard what sat beneath them. Anne had been placed inside the circle. She had been left outside it. Camilla's face hardened, but the hurt came through anyway. The Queen consort told Charles that she had stood beside him through years of judgment, yet when the most private decision arrived, he had turned away from her. Charles closed his eyes for a moment, caught between compassion for his wife and loyalty to the boundaries his mother had left behind. He wanted to soften the blow. He wanted to explain it, without making it sound like rejection. But every careful word only sharpened the truth. Anne's name became the blade between them. Camilla asked why the princess alone had been given such authority, why no shared oversight had been allowed, why no family balance had been considered. Charles finally touched the file and said Anne would never exploit it. The sentence landed with brutal force. The Queen consort went silent, because there are some answers that do not need to be shouted to leave a scar. Charles watched Camilla turn away, and he understood that the confrontation had not healed anything. It had only exposed the cost. Anne's authority had protected Elizabeth's legacy, but it had also opened a wound inside his own marriage. Somewhere beyond that closed door, William was already being drawn closer to the crisis, because the future king would soon have to understand what his father had truly done. But behind Charles's decision was not only emotion, there was power, and the palace was about to learn who truly controlled the Queen's legacy. The palace could survive arguments. It could survive wounded pride. What it could not survive was uncertainty around the Queen's private estate. Behind the closed doors, the issue was not only who inherited, it was who had authority to decide what remained hidden, what could be transferred, what would never leave the family, and what might one day define Queen Elizabeth's final message to the crown. Charles met the senior legal advisor without ceremony, because ceremony would only make the truth heavier. The advisor laid out the danger in careful words. If control over the Queen's private estate was shared, then every decision could become a dispute. Every letter could invite a question. Every family object could become a symbol of favor or rejection. The authority clause, the section of a legal document that explains who has the power to make final decisions, left no room for confusion. Anne had sole discretion. Anne read those words alone, and her expression tightened when she reached the phrase. The princess did not look relieved. She looked trapped by duty. Sole discretion meant she alone could approve access, preservation, family distribution, and protection of personal items connected to Elizabeth's private world. Anne understood why that mattered. The estate was not only valuable because of what it contained. It mattered because it carried the late monarch's private feelings, her final loyalties, and the quiet pieces of herself she never gave to the public. William understood the symbolism at once. The prince knew Anne was not being raised above the crown. She was being placed beside memory as its guard. That difference mattered, because the monarchy survives on order, but families survive on trust. If Elizabeth's private identity was mishandled, the damage would not stay behind palace doors. It would turn into doubt, and doubt is dangerous when the crown depends on confidence. William saw why Charles had chosen discipline over comfort, even if that choice brought pain. Camilla learned the next part with visible stillness. Certain rooms and heirlooms would require Anne's approval before anyone could review them. The queen consort heard the rule, and the wound from Charles's decision deepened. This was no longer emotional distance. It was practical power. Anne could say yes. Anne could say no. Camilla could request, but she could not command. For a woman who had fought for her place beside the king, that limit felt colder than any public insult. Charles carried the cost in silence, but the locked cabinet changed everything. One cabinet in the Queen's private apartments had been listed separately from the rest of the estate, marked for restricted handling under Anne's personal authority. The king knew that separate listing meant its contents were special. Anne knew it too. William sensed the room shift when the cabinet was mentioned, and Camilla understood that another door had just moved beyond her reach. Anne's authority was no longer a sentence on paper. It had become a living force inside the palace. Charles had signed it, William had accepted it, Camilla had felt it, and Anne now had to enforce it. And once her authority became active, the first door closed faster than anyone expected. The fallout began with a door. Not a speech, not a headline, not a palace statement. A door. When a request was made to review items from Queen Elizabeth's private rooms, Anne refused to authorize it. The reply was brief, controlled, and devastating. Inside the palace, everyone understood the message. The estate was no longer a soft space for negotiation. It had become a line that could not be crossed. Anne gave her answer through a written refusal sent to a senior household official, and the wording carried no softness. The princess made clear that nothing would be moved, inspected, reviewed, or reassigned without her direct approval. A household official is a senior palace staff member trusted to manage royal rooms, records, and private arrangements. But even that authority stopped at Anne's door now. Her decision mattered because it proved her power was not symbolic. It also mattered because it told everyone that Elizabeth's belongings would not be handled through quiet pressure. Camilla received the news in a private sitting room, and she went still. The queen consort did not need anyone to explain the meaning. Anne had not simply delayed a request, she had rejected it. Camilla understood that the confirmation had become real in the most personal way possible. Certain rooms connected to Elizabeth were now beyond her reach, unless the princess allowed entry. For a woman who had spent years trying to secure her place inside the royal family, that refusal felt like another locked door. Charles heard what Anne had done and carried the sadness openly. The king had signed the decision because he believed the estate needed protection, but now he could see the emotional cost unfolding in real time. He knew Camilla would feel excluded. He knew Anne would be blamed for enforcing what he had created. And still, Charles did not reverse it, because undoing the order would make Elizabeth's private legacy vulnerable again. That was the cruelty of duty. It could protect the dead while wounding the living. William quietly supported the restriction, though he understood why the household felt shaken. The prince believed the queen's private estate had to be shielded from emotional bargaining, because once one exception was made, every future request would become harder to refuse. William saw that Anne's firmness might be painful, but pain was not always proof of injustice. Sometimes it was proof that a boundary had finally been drawn. Anne's next order made the palace colder. The locked cabinet in the queen's private apartments would remain sealed, and its key would stay under her personal supervision. The princess did not explain what was inside. She only made sure no one else could reach it. Charles understood the meaning at once, and William did too. Camilla felt the power of that silence from across the palace. Anne had closed the first door, but she had not done it with cruelty. She had done it with grief. Charles knew that better than anyone, because behind the refusal was a daughter still guarding her mother. Yet behind Anne's firm refusal was not coldness, it was grief, and Charles was the only person who could hear it without looking away. For the first time since the confirmation, Anne and Charles sat alone without advisors, without files, and without the machinery of monarchy pressing against every word. The brother and sister, who had once watched their mother carry the crown, now faced the cost of protecting what she left behind. There was no triumph in Anne's voice, no relief in Charles's, only the painful understanding that duty had demanded something deeply personal from them both. Anne did not speak at first. She let the quiet sit between them, because both she and Charles knew the refusal had changed everything. The king had made her sole heir to the queen's private estate, but now that title felt less like inheritance and more like guard duty over grief. Sole heir meant one person carried final control, and in this case, it meant Anne alone could protect Elizabeth's private possessions, letters, and final wishes from pressure. The princess looked at Charles and admitted that it felt like standing watch over their mother's final breath. Charles lowered his gaze, and the pain finally showed. He told Anne he had delayed the decision because he knew it would wound Camilla. The king understood that the queen consort would see the choice as a rejection, and he knew the family would read it as a sign of trust being placed elsewhere. But Charles also knew that if he waited too long, Elizabeth's private estate could become a battlefield of requests, interpretations, and quiet resentment. He had tried to spare feelings. Instead, he had sharpened them. Anne answered with calm resolve. The princess told Charles that their mother had trusted discipline more than sentiment when the future of the monarchy was at stake. She reminded him that Elizabeth had survived by knowing when to be kind and when to be firm. That truth mattered because the estate was not only about objects, it was about the late monarch's private judgment, the pieces of her life that explained what she valued, who she trusted, and what she feared might happen after she was gone. Charles became emotional when Anne mentioned their mother's final weeks. The king had carried those memories in silence, but his sister spoke of them with the blunt tenderness only she could use. Anne said Elizabeth had not wanted her private world turned into rivalry or palace drama. Then she revealed, through a private conversation recorded in the king's personal notes, why the locked cabinet mattered so much. It contained personal letters and instructions, not for public display, not for family competition, but for protection. Charles understood then that Anne had not refused access to punish anyone. She had refused because she was guarding the last private boundary their mother had left behind. The king looked at his sister with a sadness that felt almost like relief. Anne had carried the burden without softening it. Charles had created the order without escaping its cost, and together they reached a fragile understanding. But peace inside one room could not stop the storm outside it. Camilla still carried the wound. William still watched the future taking shape. And while Anne and Charles found a fragile understanding, the world beyond the gates was already turning one private decision into a national judgment. By morning, the palace silence had broken. The story was no longer trapped behind private doors or whispered in royal corridors. It was on front pages, television panels, and phones across the country. The public did not see a technical estate decision. They saw a royal verdict. Anne had been trusted. Camilla had been bypassed. Charles had chosen memory over comfort, and the monarchy had exposed its deepest emotional fault line. Anne became the face of the headline before she ever spoke. One major newspaper carried a stark image of the princess beside the words, "The Queen's Trust, Anne named sole heir." That headline mattered because it turned a private estate decision into a public symbol. Sole heir, in plain terms, meant Anne alone had final authority over the late monarch's personal estate. The country did not read it as paperwork. It read it as a message about loyalty, discipline, and who Elizabeth trusted beyond the noise of royal life. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, and the mood was not simple. Some praised Anne as the one royal who had never chased attention, saying the Queen's legacy was safest with her. Others whispered about Camilla, wondering what it meant for the Queen consort to stand beside Charles, yet remain outside this final circle of trust. Buckingham Palace, the monarch's main official London residence, and the place where national royal moments often become public theater, suddenly felt like the center of a family wound everyone could now see. Charles watched the coverage with controlled sadness. The king had expected reaction, but not this much judgment. A broadcaster described the confirmation as the most personal royal decision of Charles's reign, and those words cut through the palace like a second announcement. Charles knew the phrase was dangerous because it framed the choice not as legal order, but as emotional truth. He had protected Elizabeth's private world, but he had also allowed the public to measure Camilla's place inside it. Camilla became the center of debate without saying a word. Commentators asked whether her limits inside the family had finally been exposed, and the Queen consort felt the old ache of being discussed rather than understood. She had endured years of scrutiny, but this felt different. This was not about popularity, it was about access. Anne had been presented as faithful guardian. Camilla had been shown as the one left outside the door. William's silence drew its own meaning. The prince was seen as quietly supportive, and that strengthened the belief that the future king valued controlled legacy over private comfort. William understood why that mattered. If the monarchy allowed personal pressure to shape Elizabeth's final wishes, then public trust could weaken. But if Anne held firm, the institution could appear disciplined, even while the family suffered behind closed doors. Anne did not celebrate the attention. Charles did not enjoy the authority of his decision. Camilla did not escape the humiliation of its meaning. And when the noise faded and the gates stood quiet again, the monarchy was left with the truth the headline could only expose, not heal. In the end, this was not only about an estate, it was about trust. King Charles confirmed Princess Anne as the sole heir to Queen Elizabeth's private world, because he believed duty needed a guardian, untouched by ambition. The palace was shocked, because the decision said what no statement could soften. Love may comfort a family, but trust decides the future. And in this moment, trust chose Anne. Charles had reached the end of the storm he created. The king knew the decision had wounded Camilla, shaken the household, and forced Anne into a role she never chased. But he also knew why it had to stand. The Queen's private estate, the personal possessions, letters, gifts, memories, and family pieces held outside the official crown was not just property. It was the last private map of Elizabeth's heart, and Charles believed only Anne could guard it, without turning grief into influence. Anne accepted the burden with solemn resolve. The princess did not treat the role as a prize, because she understood the difference between owning something and protecting it. She would not use the estate to raise herself above the family. She would not allow the locked cabinet, the private letters, or the hidden instructions to become palace weapons. Anne knew that some parts of a monarch's life must be guarded, not displayed, not traded, and not softened for anyone's comfort. Camilla absorbed the wound in silence. The Queen consort had stood beside Charles, but this decision forced her to accept a painful truth. Proximity to the throne did not mean access to every sacred part of royal history. That realization bruised her deeply. It did not erase her place beside the king, but it showed the limit of that place inside Elizabeth's private world. Camilla had not been publicly rejected, yet the meaning felt impossible to miss. William saw the lesson with clear eyes. The prince understood that monarchy does not survive by satisfying everyone. It survives by placing responsibility where discipline is strongest. The future king watched Charles carry the pain of his choice, watched Anne carry the duty of it, and watched Camilla carry the hurt it left behind. William knew this was the kind of decision a monarch makes alone, then lives with forever. Charles found painful peace only when he accepted that love and trust are not always the same. The king loved his family, but he trusted Anne with the queen's most private legacy. That was the final verdict. The palace began in shock, moved through confrontation, and ended with a hard but stable truth. Elizabeth's private world would remain under Anne's watch. There is no unresolved ending here. Charles made the choice. Anne accepted the burden. Camilla absorbed the wound. William understood the lesson. And the monarchy learned that the most powerful inheritance is not wealth, it is trust. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.